afternoon, everybody. It's Close of Business Tuesday, and I say it every week, but every week it seems to be true. Wow, we got a fantastic show for you today. It's so good, we're going to jump right to it. We've got Walter Isaacson with us. You probably know Walter, but just in case you don't, he was at the original CNN. He was the editor of Time. He was the CEO of the Aspen Institute. He's an acclaimed author on everybody from Steve Jobs to Leonardo da Vinci. He's a great friend of our firm. I don't know how we got so lucky to have him. He's a professor at Tulane now, author, thought leader, great guy. Well, welcome, Walter Isaacson. We're so happy to have you.
Thanks, Maynard. It's great to be part of the family, both of Perella Weinberg and Tudor Pickering Holt. And between you and Peter Weinberg, the two finest people I've ever worked with. So.
Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for dialing in, Walter. No, seriously, Walter, we thought, you threw us a curveball like you always do. I mean that in the greatest way. We were going to talk politics, but holy smokes, you're in the Washington Post today talking about your participation in the Pfizer trial. And you've got some really interesting angles on that. I think we should start there because it has to do with your new book and it's so topical. And so why don't we do that?
My next book is on biotechnology, specifically genetic editing. And it follows Jennifer Doudna, who just won the Nobel Prize, and the other scientists who've invented these tools to edit our own genes. But the tool uses RNA, the less famous sibling of DNA, in order to cut our genes. So I've been very interested in RNA, and especially when coronavirus comes along, all the coronavirus is a snippet of RNA enclosed in a little capsule. That's all that virus is. So there is now a set of vaccines that have been developed that instead of taking like a traditional vaccine, the way we do measles or mumps, you take the virus that causes them and you put a weakened version of the virus into a vaccine, you get a shot, and that's supposed to stimulate your immune system. This new type of vaccine, instead of putting the weakened version of the virus, it just puts a little bit of RNA into your cells, and your cells use that RNA to produce a component of the virus, in this case, the spike protein. I don't want to get too technical there, but I'll just move on and say, I thought that was really fascinating. So in New Orleans, which because of our challenges, we often have clinical trials here, it was online that I could sign up to be part of the Pfizer trial for the vaccine that they were creating. They took me right away. I went to Ochsner Hospital, some of you know, down on Jefferson Highway, and they gave me the shot and then a booster shot 3 weeks later. And every day I take my phone and fill out all my symptoms or non-symptoms in my case. And it was just this week, as I'm sure you noticed by watching the markets yesterday, that Pfizer said it's been more than 90% effective. And that's huge. It means that in the late November, I think November 20th, 21st, the FDA Scientific Advisory Committee will have a meeting and they'll be presented with that data. And I think it's likely that they will give an emergency use authorization to Pfizer to produce this vaccine, a very similar vaccine, same RNA concept being done by Moderna. I know they're in the late stage of their clinical trial. I suspect they may have good data too, and either this month or next, they'll get approved. And there's one other vaccine that's not an RNA vaccine, but the one that AstraZeneca is doing, which also is a genetic vaccine. All three of those are almost ready to go. So as you saw in the markets this week, I think there's some optimism that by January and February, we'll be rolling out some vaccines.
So, it's fascinating that you did this, and at some level, it's just like you answered a ad in the paper. Was it really sort of that straightforward? You just volunteered and they said, sure.
Yeah. I mean, I tell you, if you once you finish watching this, Google clinical trials, and you'll probably find that even, I don't know, at MD Anderson or someplace in Houston, they're doing some clinical trials. I wanted to make sure I got into Pfizer. I had all sorts of schemes where I was going to, because I was writing a book, I was going to have Jennifer Doudna, other people who work with Pfizer, help get me into the thing. But I typed in my name, my age, my cell phone number. And believe me, boom, the next day I got a phone call, and they didn't know I was a reporter. You know, it was just somebody from Ochsner saying, you know, come on down if you want to do it. And there are 44,000 people who've done it. I actually would recommend it because now that I'm in the clinical trial, they keep sending me other ones that they might want me to do. I think it's a little bit like jury duty or something. If you're if you're healthy and you're willing to try something, it's just good for science, and it's good for you because it makes me and others understand these things better. And it kind of made me feel good. I was doing a bit of a civic duty, which is testing out this vaccine. And I didn't grow an extra finger or anything. Nothing bad happened.
No, it's very commendable. What was your wife like? No, honey, I really don't want you to do that.
Yeah. So Kathy was like, no, I don't want you to do it. So I get the first shot. She notices I'm fine. A few days later, she says, hey, maybe she should do it as well. And she signed up and got the Johnson and Johnson, because same Ochsner in New Orleans. I mean, the thing about New Orleans is we have a lot of mixed blessings because of, we get to, for example, dance in the eyes of hurricanes and see the pleasure of that. Well, if you want to get into a clinical trial, and I suspect Texas is the same way, there's a lot of clinical trials going on because we have health challenges. And so when she signed up, she got a call right away. And I suspect if you type in, Maynard, right now, clinical trial Houston, and you fill out the form, you might get a phone call in a few days. There's one for growing hair, by the way. It cures baldness.
This low maintenance life, I like it so much. I'm just glad I don't have it anymore. Does that mean when you do a clinical trial and it's the RNA-based approach that there is less risk to you as the participant because it's either not going to work or work? You're not actually taking the virus and then
correct. That's correct. And let me make it clear that half the people in the trial get a placebo, salt water. And I don't know. They made me cover my eyes just to make sure I didn't have any indication. So I still don't know whether I've gotten a placebo or not. But if it gets approved and I got the placebo, I automatically get the vaccine right away. I'm sorry, what was the other part that you asked?
No, that was really it. Just that it seems like the risk to you participating in a
I think these new forms of vaccines are safer. Mm-hmm. You're not quite old enough to remember, nor am I, but I vaguely remember when the polio vaccine came in. And the very first one was Sabin had the weakened polio virus you were injected with. And everybody worried, as I would still, which is, something could go wrong with that. Then Salk came through with a killed version of the virus, and that was considered safer. This is yet another step safer. You don't even have any of the virus put in you. You just have a piece of RNA that makes a protein that's the same as the spike protein on the surface of the coronavirus. And that spike protein is not going to give you, COVID, because it doesn't have doesn't have any part of the COVID virus with it besides the spike protein.
So Walter, you're always so good at seeing the.
Wait, hold on a second, Maynard. Yeah. Let me say one more thing about it. That's even more important.
Okay.
An RNA vaccine has some downsides. It's got to be stored at way below zero temperature. It's hard to, but it has a huge upside, which is once we conquer COVID-19, we're going to get hit by another virus. There'll be some virus that comes along next year or whatever. An RNA vaccine can be reprogrammed by a college biology student in a day. All you need to know is the sequence of the new virus that attacks,
Hmm.
whether it's a flu virus or Ebola virus or AIDS. Doesn't work on AIDS, sorry to say, but Ebola and flu. And
Hmm.
so it can be repurposed instantly for every new virus that attacks us, which is not something a traditional vaccine, you can't do that. It takes years to usually
Wow.
develop them.
So I think that's where I was headed. I didn't know what you just shared, but is this one of those things? You're always good at seeing the positive. This has been a year of suffering, but I mean, this is really a big breakthrough in how we do things, and could just mean all kinds of great things for the future as we fight other
Well, that's why I'm writing this book, called The Code Breaker. It won't be out until March, but I hope to get to Houston and have a party then with real beer and not have to do it on Zoom, Lord willing. But the book is
Zoom was down 20% on Monday.
Yeah, right,
Hey, we're
exactly.
going
No,
back
wouldn't
to the
that
real
just
world.
so is Amazon. It's like, okay, I'm going to go shopping again. But yeah, the technologies that I've described in my book include the ability to edit genes and the ability to make these instant vaccines for any new virus that comes along. Editing our genes will be even more consequential. It's already been used to cure sickle cell anemia. But I mean, eventually we're going to have some moral issues that we're going to have to face, because it's not that hard to edit the genes of your unborn child and give greater muscle mass or make the child taller or even increase the IQ points. And so when we get to design our own children and genetically edit our kids, that's going to be a big moral issue we're going to have to face.
Mm. What would you say, Walter? Did you get any impressions of what the FDA and what the government more broadly, like how have they contributed to making this process easier, or what would you say about the institutional effort, as far as you can tell, to get this done?
It's been really good. I mean, everybody criticizes the administration on various things. I think the CDC has had some problems, but the FDA and Operation Warp Speed, which is the administration's project to get vaccines and other treatments underway, has done a whole lot of good. And under Francis Collins, who directs the National Institute of Health, Pfizer was not directly funded by Operation Warp Speed, but the federal government did guarantee to buy, I can't remember how many, 100 million doses of it. And so that allowed Pfizer to make its own investment. And so the government has done an extremely good job, but more importantly, the private sector has done an even better job. It takes years usually to develop a vaccine, but we're going to have probably 5 vaccines by the end of February or March, and 2 or 3 by the end of December.
Do you know, has there been much, there's different companies, and then sometimes there were different efforts in different countries. Do you know the extent to which it's been internationalized or
It's very international, and for all the credit I've given Pfizer, it's actually called the BioNTech Pfizer vaccine because it was developed in Germany, in Mainz, Germany, by a company called BioNTech. And they discovered and devised the way to use RNA as a messenger to have our cells produce this thing. And then after they invented it, probably, I think it was March of this year, they had an arrangement with Pfizer where they were doing other drugs and vaccines with Pfizer, and they hammered out a deal with Pfizer to be the big company conducting the trials and manufacturing it. So this one that I'm in is actually a German-US collaboration. The AstraZeneca one was developed at Oxford University. Not confusingly, but this will muddy the waters. There's some very traditional vaccines that use sort of killed versions of the coronavirus or weakened versions, like I talked about old-fashioned vaccines, that are now being done by Sinovac and are actually already in use in the Chinese military. And I'm pretty brave. I'd be in a clinical trial. I'm not brave, but I mean, I had no worry about being in a clinical trial for the Pfizer one. If somebody said be in the clinical trial for this Chinese one by Sinovac, I would wait a few months before I did it. And I think Russia has one that they say is working, but it's unclear since the virus is running rampant in Russia. So this has been generally international, and more importantly, the manufacturing will be. The Gates Foundation has funded India, which has a lot of our pharmaceuticals, as you would guess, are made in India, to start making these vaccines even before they've been approved. I think 400 million doses of these things are being made in India, which will be thrown away if the vaccine doesn't get approved. But the Gates Foundation, bless its heart, can afford to do that, because one thing that would be bad is a vaccine gets approved and then everybody has to wait 6 months or a year for it to be manufactured.
No, it's fantastic. It's such a positive story coming together. What would you have said if we were in January 2020 and you had asked the experts then, hey, how quickly could you make a RNA-based vaccine if an unknown virus came along? What do you think? How much time have we cut out of the process with all this year, do you suppose?
That's a good question, and I don't want to pretend I know exactly, but nobody would have predicted, and nobody did predict in February when this thing came along, that you would have a vaccine within 6 months. Almost every expert said 18 months it would be before there would be a vaccine. I can, remember it. And so it's been, and look, in our industry, whether it's Tudor Pickering or Perella Weinberg or whatever, when you're looking at what are going to be the next great technologies, clearly biotechnology, not only for pharmaceuticals, but for energy, for climate, for renewables, everything else, this ability, I call it that, as I say, that molecules will be the next microchip, meaning instead of everything being done digitally, we're going to be using molecular biology to solve a lot of our problems on agriculture, energy. And so that's why I'm writing this book. I think we're entering the biotech century.
Okay, so we got it's amazing. It was a gift that you were part of all that. We do need to ask you about the current state of the American political landscape. You're a historian. Does this kind of remind you of when Reagan took office? I think the hostages were released on day one. Does this sort of feel like Biden 2 days after this official acceptance speech, the vaccine came out? Like, is this just a great bit of luck for all of us, particularly the new president?
Yeah, I mean, I think, especially within the Trump administration, there's probably some feeling like, is this some conspiracy that they
There's always a conspiracy, right, Walter?
Yeah, but then they waited until 2 days after, the election was called to announce this. No, it has always been on this timeline. I mean, as I say, I followed it very closely. August 1st was when really the first wave of participants in the Moderna and Pfizer trials came in. They got to 44,000 at a certain point. And it could have been that they would have had enough data by about October 22nd or so, which was the last FDA scientific meeting. But they didn't have enough data. You had to have 90 people get COVID and to be not part of the placebo, to be in the placebo group for it to start giving you meaningful data. So I don't think there was any conspiracy to have the data come in the way it did. As I say, it could have happened a week or two earlier. I would have predicted, I think I told you probably in August that I think in late October we'll have the data for the trial. But I don't think there was a conspiracy on the companies to hold off getting the data until the election was over.
Walter, it seems like sometimes we get these ideas of conspiracy theory because everybody's a publisher these days. We often, hear the question, "Where are the editors?" And you were the editor of Time Magazine and the CEO of CNN. What's it like being Walter Isaacson and seeing this democratization of information with all of the freedom and chaos that has come along with it?
Yeah, we used to have gatekeepers that said, no, this is not ready for publication. We're not going to, print this theory about QAnon's theory about pedophiles. And I kind of liked it in a way because I was one of the gatekeepers. And, I had my friends at Newsweek and New York Times. And if something wasn't ready for prime time, it wasn't put on page one or on the evening news. But that was a bad system. It was sort of a control of the news media. I hate to say by an elite because I was part of it, and I never think of myself as actually part of an elite, but we got to control what was news. So I liked it, at least, philosophically. The internet comes along and it breaks the back of the East Coast media elite determining what is the news. So this is a huge upside. I remember even when, the Clinton scandal broke and Newsweek held the story, didn't run it. And Time, we were scrambling to get the story, but Saturday night we didn't run it. Next day, Matt Drudge did. It was on the internet. And so that's when the dam broke. You couldn't hold stories. If you didn't publish it, a Matt Drudge would put it on the internet. But then it's a mixed blessing. And nowadays, there's a significant number of people who follow QAnon and its related sites on Facebook and believe that there's an international pederast ring that involved pizza parlor in Washington where somebody came with a gun. I mean, totally nutty things. Or they believe that COVID is a hoax or whatever. And so we've gone to an extreme where nobody is filtering the news and saying, is this right or wrong? I just got off my Tulane class right before we did this. And the subject of the class was something called Section 230, which is part of the FCC law that says if you're a platform like Facebook or Twitter, you don't get held accountable for what people post on your platform. If somebody wrote a letter to the editor of Time and we published it, we could be sued at Time Magazine if it said something false. The famous case of Times versus Sullivan, New York Times versus Sullivan, was not about an article in the New York Times. It was about an ad somebody took out in the New York Times. And the Times got sued because somebody thought the ad was defamatory. But if you put something defamatory or false on Facebook or Twitter, you can't sue Facebook or Twitter. I think, I'm sorry, that's a long answer, Colin, but I think we're going to have to change that a bit, where these platforms are going to have to bear some responsibility, the court of law and the court of public opinion, for what they spread. And they'll say, well, we can't police every post there. No, but if they're amplifying a post, if they're spreading something that's wrong and it's called to their attention, I think they should be able to be held accountable.
And this became particularly relevant, right, Walter, when some of those platforms, if they start excluding certain people or editing certain people, then they're not an open platform. And then that's what might open them up to this type of legal exposure. Is that the right way to describe it?
That's how Section 230 came about, which is if you moderated your platform, you were considered to be a publisher. And so you could be sued if somebody put something up. But if you left it open, you couldn't be sued. And it was all these perverse things like the law often creates is perverse. When you try to regulate something, you get perverse effects. And now we're in the midst, both on the left and on the right. Donald Trump wants to revoke Section 230, but so does, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. People like me who are not on the right or on the left say, well, wait a minute, let's not go too fast. There's perverse consequences if we just throw everything out as well. I mean, we want people to be able to post. If I were Twitter, I'd let Trump post whatever he wants. I mean,
Yeah.
it's news. People have the right to read what Trump posts. On the other hand, if you're bullying or lobbying or slandering or, somebody, or you're giving false health information saying drink, bleach or something to cure yourself of COVID, I think the platform, or you're doing child pornography. I mean, that's how Section 230 came about, was they were trying to get rid of child pornography.
So here's a tough question, but it's and I've had a few friends ask me this week, or they want to chew on this, which is, if you take a step back and you look at the American election in its entirety, what message did the American people deliver to all of us? What do you think is the message? And obviously people felt differently, but what do you think the message was?
Well, it's a hard question. If you ask 300 million people, you can get 310 million answers of what the message was. I'll give you my personal one, which is the country was kind of tired of the uproar, upheaval, and the personal aspects that Trump had projected, but we're basically still somewhat of a conservative country. Republicans did very well, better than expected, especially in the House of Representatives. I think we'll probably hold the Senate. We'll see what happens in Georgia. And Trump didn't do that badly. And I think the conservatism that exists is not just, we saw a lot of rural Hispanics who are resentful of sort of liberal dogmas and all the woke, defund the police stuff that people on the left are saying. One of the most interesting things to me happened in Texas, which is not that there was a lot of Hispanic votes for Trump, but that there were the rural whites, the rural blacks, and rural Hispanics in like the Rio Grande Valley went for Trump, whereas the urban, vote tended to go for Biden. I think you're in Harris County, right?
Yes, sir.
I think Harris County probably went overwhelmingly for Biden. You go to King County, or you go even further out, it went overwhelmingly for Trump. So the great divide in our society is not necessarily on racial lines or Hispanic or whatever. It's on sort of the urban sensibility that relishes diversity and tends to be, especially the educated urban, and tends to have lost touch with the people who go to work and carry the lunch pail and live in rural areas. And that divide in our society, we have to get rid of. And I think the left is going to be in real trouble if it keeps spouting things about, goes to the extreme of the extreme parts of a Green New Deal, or defunds the police, or all those ridiculous slogans. I think a lot of people resent that. So even though Biden won, I don't think there was a left-wing message. And by the way, Biden was the most centrist of all of the potential Democratic candidates. One reason I was glad he won is that if he had lost, I know the Democratic Party would have then gone to the far AOC, Elizabeth Warren extreme. They say, it proves we can't win by nominating a centrist. But Biden is somebody who never would have touted defund the police. And even though he's been dancing around the question of fracking, at least he's dancing around it. He's not trying to ban all fracking. So I think we could use a breather, and my best outcome would be a moderate Biden administration, a president who doesn't tweet, and please don't quote me outside of this, session, but a Republican Senate that can perform a check on and you know what? Deep in his heart, I think Biden would actually prefer a Republican Senate, because it means he's not going to be pushed to the left. And I know Biden pretty well. His heart is not on the left. He doesn't want to be pushed there.
So what do you do? let's say if you were advising Joe Biden on, it seems like his best bullet point really was that he was going to be a uniter, and the implication was he was going to tamp down the noise that comes out of Washington. If you were advising him on a cabinet, on how to pull the country together, what few moves could he make? Like, what would you tell him?
I would say that was the exact right message. Right now, the main thing for America is we need a uniter, not a divider. Whether it's on how we fight COVID, should we be wearing masks? We don't need this divisiveness. We need to remember we're one nation with one people. And so I would try to have an administration that reflects that. My heart believes that Biden believes it because I've heard him say it, for 40 years. This has been his message. And when he won the election and he did his victory speech 3 nights ago, that was the whole message of the speech, which is, I'm going to try to unite this nation, even if you didn't vote for me. And I know maybe people say he's just saying it. Well, saying it is at least the first step.
Better than not saying it. Yeah.
Better than not saying it, the way half the Democratic Party would be, which is they wouldn't be saying it. They'd say, now it's our turn, let's jam it to him. That's why I think in his heart, too, he's quite happy to say, I'm not sure I could get a left-wing cabinet through the Senate. I'm not sure McConnell would put it up for a vote. So I would say if I were him on the cabinet, I would probably put Lael Brainerd or Roger Ferguson, 2 very centrist people, one of them at Treasury. I think that if I were him, I don't think he's going to do this, I would appoint a Republican to one of the top 3 jobs, meaning I would appoint Bob Corker to be Secretary of State, the former Tennessee senator who served with Biden on the Foreign Relations Committee. Mm-hmm. I think you want a defense hawk almost, like a Michelle Flournoy, to be at the Pentagon. I think, and you're looking at economic policy, I think you'll see Jeff Zients, people who have been around for a while. Ron Klain will be chief of staff, and Jeff Zients will be the chief economics person. But maybe that's my hope and my dream. I might wake up one morning and Bernie Sanders is Secretary of Labor, but I don't think so. And I don't think he should.
What do you do? I think that's the question everybody has had watching the Democratic Party. If you're Biden and you got the support of Bernie and AOC and Elizabeth Warren, do you have to give them some spots? Like, how do you keep them happy?
Well, one reason you can avoid giving them spots is if the Republicans keep control of the Senate, or more confusingly, we're not going to know. He's going to have to pick his cabinet, not knowing how the Georgia votes will turn out probably. But you just say, look, whether or not you want me to put Bernie in the cabinet, he's not going to get confirmed, and I'm not going to have that fight.
He says, I would love to have you, Bernie.
Huh?
He says, Bernie, you would be fantastic. It's just those darn Republicans.
Yeah, although I think Biden is more of a straight shooter. He'll just sort of say, no, I'm picking, you say to Elizabeth Warren, you can't be Treasury. I'm picking, Roger Ferguson, Lael Brainerd, somebody like that. So I think he believes that America is best governed from the center. But to answer your question, what it will take is not simply him being able to say, I can't get Elizabeth Warren confirmed. He will need 12 Republicans at least in the Senate to give some indication that we will try to find common ground and compromise. We all know how to do it. We could all find an infrastructure bill that would work, a COVID relief bill that would work. We could even figure out how to do an Affordable Care Act revision that will work. But you need to have Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, but a few others, Mitt Romney, who are going to say, yes, when we're going to try to find common ground and we'll agree with you. And the most important player will be Mitch McConnell. Now, Mitch McConnell, you could go online. There's a wonderful McConnell institute in Kentucky, at the University of Kentucky, where Joe Biden's the featured speaker. They spend 45 minutes together, and it's like, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. They're buddies. Mitch McConnell, when you read his book, you listen to him in private, he would love, despite what his detractors say, he would love to get back to a place where you had a regular order of business in government and you had committee chairs and ranking members trying to craft bills together. And Mitch McConnell could be an ally for Joe Biden and say, I'm going to oppose you when I disagree with you, but we could probably figure out the Affordable Care Act. The question is whether the extremes of both parties, whether the extremes of the Democrats on the AOC side would go ballistic, and whether the Trumpists would go ballistic if a Mitch McConnell said we can work out an infrastructure bill and we can work out an Affordable Care Act revision.
What would you advise the Republicans if Mitch McConnell came to you and said, okay, Walter, how do I play this, and how do we?
I'd say put the country on. I mean, I've actually,
Yeah.
I've talked to some of them. And by the way, you can talk to, I'll let him speak for himself, but your partners like Bob Steele and you've talked to Paul Ryans and others. I would say, first of all, look, you're going to be remembered whether you put your country first. Mm-hmm. So going into an all-out resistance now, that might help you not get primaried in 2 years if you're up for re-election. But first of all, do what you know is right.
Yeah.
Secondly, it's probably good for the Republican Party to say we're a party that can stand up for conservative principles, like Mitt Romney says he will do, but also work together to get a cabinet confirmed and get a defense bill and an infrastructure bill out. And I do think you have to, if you're a Paul Ryan Republican, worry about the basic principles, which is like the deficit and other things, but be willing to cut loose the Trumpists in the midst. You have to look at what a Lindsey Graham is going to do. I hate to be mean about Lindsey Graham, but he seems to have no strong core. He seems to be able to flip back and forth or whatever. And the question is whether, he used to love Joe Biden, whether he's going to now say, all right, I'm going to try to work with him, or is he going to appeal to the Trump base, hoping that he can run for president in 4 years? I'm just hoping there'll be enough Republicans who don't feel they have to cater to the Trump base. It doesn't even have to be a majority of the party. It just has to be, a third of the party is willing to do that. And I hope there's enough Democrats that feel they don't have to cower to an AOC.
Walter, as a professor, I know that you talk sometimes about the Schlesinger father and son and the cycles of American history. How much of what we're seeing happening now is these broader cycles as opposed to these personalities? And that may be just too enormous a question, so just run with it as you will.
No, I do think we have cycles both in terms of policy and personality. The Schlesinger thesis, which, as you say, was Arthur Schlesinger Sr. and then Arthur Schlesinger Jr., who, we go through periods of real progressivism and then retrenchment, and that makes sense. I mean, it's also good for the country. Einstein has said democracy seems to have a gyroscope. It'll tilt too much one way and then it'll figure out how to right itself. And to me, actually, after the Nixon years, it's not just about conservatism, liberalism. After the Nixon years, we needed a respite. And by happenstance, we got Gerald Ford, who was great, and then Jimmy Carter, who was a reaction to the Nixonian period. Well, as a reaction to the Jimmy Carter period, which in some ways you could say wasn't as visionary and was weak, you get a period of Reagan. So I think we go in waves, both in terms of progressivism and retrenchment, but also in personality. It's almost as if it happens by magic. There is nobody who is more the antithesis of Donald Trump than Joe Biden. Joe Biden, whatever you may think of, some of his policies, he's a person who has just a great deal of empathy and compassion and decency and wants to quiet things down and be a healer. So maybe it was fortuitous, or maybe it's just the way the electorate is. Of all the Democrats, it picked the one who is not some huge, flame carrying anti-Trumpist, but somebody who's going to calm us down.
Here's a funny question, because sometimes when you think about Trumpism, you can't tell if Trumpism is it a style or is it a substantive set of policies? So is it a Trumpist just, believes in making a lot of noise, or is a Trumpist a low tax, low regulation,
I don't think it's either. With all due respect, Maynard, because it's not low deficit, fiscal responsibility, traditional conservatism, and it's not just let's make a whole lot of noise and tweet in all caps or whatever Trump does. I think it's a understandable populist resentment among, people like myself, and I'll probably put a lot of people on this, meeting in it. We all believed in things like free trade, and we believed in things like technology, and we believed in globalization and to some extent immigration or whatever. And that indeed made our economy stronger. I think what we didn't understand is that it really left a lot of people out. A lot of people made a lot of money, including, all of us, I guess. But a lot of people who used to go to the Maytag plant in Keokuk, Iowa, and be able to know they could send their kids to college because they had a good job at a good wage with good benefits. That Keokuk Maytag plant is now in Mexico. And whether it's immigration or outsourcing or trade, it sounded good, but you created a group of people who rightfully and understandably felt they got screwed by all this globalization gobbledygook. And also they felt resentful about, liberal elites who use words like Latinx or use words like transsectionality or whatever words there are that just look down upon the people in this country who have a more traditional view of certain values. And that resentment was reflected in everything from Tea Party movement. But I think Trump tapped into that well, and we should not denigrate that. That was something that he did smartly, and we should listen to that message, because some of us, including me, were part of the Davos, Aspen global meritocratic establishment. We lost touch.
It's fascinating. Well, do you have any sense of, you mentioned you have spent some time with Biden. What would a centrist energy approach, what would that mean if you were trying to be centrist in that realm? Listen to he's got to stay true to his campaign promises around various things, but what do you think centrist energy might look like from Joe Biden?
Yeah, well, myself and Danny Yergin, who you all know well, and you go to his conference at the Houston Intercontinental, and he's been an advisor to some extent of Biden. I think we all have to, Biden understands this, realize that the unconventional extraction of oil and gas was an enormous boon to America. It was a great advance. Dan Yergin's book, The New Map, shows how important it was for everything from manufacturing, whatever. And Biden, I think, stepped in it a little bit when he said the oil industry is going to go away. He tried to walk He tried to walk that back, but I think he should walk it back. He should say, no, there's going to be oil and gas, but we are going to make a transition. Just by the way, as Tudor, Pickering, and Holt is part of that transition, Halliburton, where I've joined Halliburton Labs as part of it, and the great energy companies are going to say we're going to have to make a transition to new forms of energy as well, to a lower carbon future. And I would talk, as Biden has talked about it, the way he says it, which I think is good, is that he says, when I see a transition to a low carbon energy future, I see the word jobs. We're going to create an energy sector that can create more jobs. So I think what you have to do is avoid throwing out the great advantages to America that have come from fracking, unconventional extraction of oil and gas, made us not only energy independent, but an exporter, changed manufacturing, everything here. That's all great, but you also have to keep your eye on the ball that America has always succeeded by being the most innovative nation. That started, hey, when Standard Oil figured out how to make a standard, I mean, that's why they got their name, a standard form of oil that people could trust. And they developed refineries all the way through to the fracking thing. And that innovation and creation of domestic jobs through a better energy mix. And I would, of course, throw in nuclear. I'm able to, I'm sure, piss people off on all sides, but obviously nuclear power should be part of the mix as well.
I'm right there with you, Walter. So we can we can join arms together.
Bill Gates is there. I mean, Bill Gates has been working very hard on creating the problem with nuclear is that America's innovation got stymied because we became neurotic about nuclear power. But if you get good innovators like a Bill Gates creating smaller and safer forms of nuclear energy, that would be a huge boon to America.
So maybe if I could ask the last question, one theme that goes through all of your books, or most of your books, is that emphasis on innovation and genius and creativity. And you already mentioned biotechnology and its importance. You also are from Louisiana, and I understand you have some family members who've worked in the energy patch. What are some of the signposts that all of us might look for that next person, technology, or business that will take us to the next level in energy in the 21st century?
Yeah, I look at my family. They unfortunately were not great oil and gas wildcatters, but they were the people who, were engineers and helped build the platforms and, do the type of things. My dad, my uncle, my granduncle were all engineers. And I would say that the lesson on innovation is something I wrote about in The Innovators, which is a book I did, as opposed to Steve Jobs' book or even the Jennifer Doudna book, which is that innovation, especially in the energy realm, is a team sport. It's a collaborative effort. In fact, if you read the beginning of Danny Yergin's book, The New Map, which is about the energy revolution, that starts with George Mitchell, it wasn't just a George Mitchell. It was dozens and dozens of innovators who figured out how to make drill bits that would work better, figured out how to do seismic reading so you could do horizontal drilling, took risks and did things. So if you say fracking, which is, to me, even though it's controversial in some quarters, is one of the great innovations that's helped America, that wasn't like Edison going to a garage and inventing a light bulb. That was hundreds of innovations and collaborations and teams that came together. So I think the new energy revolution and the new biotech revolution will be different from the digital revolution. In the digital revolution, a guy or a gal could go to a garret or a garage, have that light bulb moment, and boom, Google comes out, or boom, Facebook comes out, or boom, you've written the first Microsoft program for basic for a computer. You can't do energy and you can't do biotech in your dorm room. It has to be a collaborative effort, and it means thousands of innovations. The problem for America, too, is that the reason you've had innovation in the digital space, but not quite as much as we need in the energy space or the biotech space, is that it's so regulated. You know, what you do on Facebook, as we said earlier, isn't all that regulated. You can do whatever you want in the digital realm. But if you're going to make a battery, if you're going to make, you know, a new form of nuclear plant, not only can't you do that in your dorm room, you have to go through all sorts of regulatory processes. So what I would say is we need new policies that encourage innovation, and we need to do what you do at TPH quite well, is bring people together, because it'll be collections of innovations that get us to the next battery, or get us to the next way to do a digital grid, or get us to an advance in solar or nuclear, or for that matter, cleaner energy, natural gas in some ways. So I don't think we should look for the one innovator that becomes the Steve Jobs of the energy revolution. Even George Mitchell wasn't George Mitchell. He was just one of hundreds of people that created an energy revolution.
Well, I only have 106 more questions, but I think I will defer because we've got to let you go. Walter, we're so appreciative of the time you spend with us and the thoughts you share. And this has been a big week for the country, for the vaccine, for the world. It's all, it's good, optimistic stuff. So thank you for spending time with us. And we loved your last comments.
Well, you know what? I'll come in March when the Code Breakers is published. And that'll be the month I predict that the fogs will finally lift, the pandemic will have receded, the earth will begin to heal, and we'll all be able to stand there, as I remember doing with you at Rice University.
That's right.
Drinking beer and having a good time. And you, Maynard, will be able to give everybody in the firm and all of the clients a free copy of my book, and I'll sign it for them.
Well, and at that, we're going to have a huge reception for you, and I'm going to stand within 2 feet of you without a mask. It's going to be.
And we're going to hug. I'm not trying to hug you. You're a little too big.
Thank you so much, Walter. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thanks for having me.